Let's take a breath and find out a little bit more about the campaign so far, the importance of this weekend. Sanet Solomon is a political analyst. She's a lecturer in the Department of Political Sciences at UNISA. Sanet, good afternoon. Thank you for agreeing to spend such a busy political weekend with us. This is the culmination of the campaigns of most of the major parties. The DA will have their event tomorrow. How would you describe the election campaigns so far? I mean, on one level, they, depending on which media you consume, in the English language media maybe, they've been a little bit muted. I don't know if political parties have really been able to change the minds of many voters.
I think that a lot of them have obviously been trying. I think we've seen them come out, try to engage with people. We've seen a lot of door-to-doors, and we've seen people in interesting places where you wouldn't ordinarily find them. I mean, it's not every day that you see former President the current President, Cyril Ramaphosa in the Western Cape doing door-to-door at someone's house. So I think it's obviously an exciting time for them, but I don't think that they have done as much as they could have, especially given that this is regarded as one of the most contested elections.
It's an interesting comment in our politics. I mean, does that suggest that they believe that voters made up their minds ages ago? And does that suggest that politics maybe is about various elements of our identity? There are all sorts of conversations we can have about that. It's a bit like maybe American elections. No one really changes their mind. It's all about turnout.
I don't necessarily think that. I think that they don't realize what is quite at stake. Unlike in previous elections where you would have, with certainty, the ANC would do very well, you would have, to a certain extent, the DA doing also quite well. And we've seen the EFF growing for like over 10 years at a consistent pace, which is something that's quite remarkable. But I think that this election is quite different, with obviously the introduction of your independent candidates. Then you have the introduction of a lot of new political parties, and these parties are quite different from your COPEs, for example. I think that Rise Mzansi appeals quite to the youth, and I think that that's something that they should look out for. You have the establishment and obviously the announcement of the MK party on the 16th of December. That's something that's quite interesting. So unlike previous year where you could with certainty say what's going to happen, you can't. And areas where you would definitely have either the DN, the EFF, and obviously the ANC contesting, you now have the Patriotic Alliance, Rise Mzansi, MK, also, and Aljama coming in and obviously like putting a spanner in the works.
There's a sort of splintering of our politics, isn't there? It used to be, and I mean this is an oversimplification, but we go back 20 years, 2004, it was really the ANC and the DA, sort of. Now, all of that is splintered.
I think so, but I think it's also an exciting development in terms of democratic South Africa. I think as a country, you want to move beyond the point where you only have one political party dominating the political landscape, but also having other political parties coming in. And I think it's a measure of how we're holding our different political parties accountable. Because, I mean, if you have an accountable democratic space, you have the ability to choose who you want to be in power and who you want to change. And I think that's something that we'll see more going into the future, where we'll see people voting people who are inactive out of office.
Sanet Solomon, thanks very much indeed, with us for most of the afternoon as part of our continuing coverage of the three major political events happening today. Of course, much of the focus on President Cyril Ramaphosa's speech, the ANC rally underway there. That stadium filling up very quickly, we understand. That's the F&B Stadium, of course, in Soweto. I think many people are going to remember it for the World Cup final match that it hosted many years ago now. But as you can see, people there listening to the speakers, listening to some of the entertainment before the main event. Live there throughout the afternoon. Let's just take a breath and look at the importance of these speeches now. Sanet Solomon is a political analyst. She's at the Department of Political Science at UNISA. Sanet, afternoon to you again. These rallies, in a way, sometimes I wonder if, because they're the final opportunity, they have the biggest audience, the biggest media audience as well for leaders. There's also nothing to lose because voting day is now only 4 days away. If maybe they're a little more honest. You suddenly, I mean, always remember, in the classic case of this is in local elections in 2021, when Julius Malema, he was with the ANC Youth League then, and he stood up before Jacob Zuma spoke as leader of the ANC, and he said, at the FNB Stadium, I mean, just outside Soweto, the geography matters, he said, the DA is for white people, the ANC is for you. And that was the ANC message going into that election, you know, such a powerful message. Do you think there's going to be some political honesty in these rallies today?
I think like the elections is quite exciting because it's obviously these rallies are about showmanship. And I think like obviously with the anniversary of the EFF, we saw them doing the whole stage lifting thing and so on. So I think it would be exciting if similar things happen during these rallies this weekend, obviously. But I also think that with regards to this particular rally, I don't know if we'll see honesty per se, but I definitely see that we will have people trying to appeal to voters. And I think in terms of appealing to voters here, we'll have an emphasis in terms of the creation of jobs. We'll have an emphasis in terms of providing opportunities, dealing with issues of inequality, quality education, and so on, because I think they know that that's what the voter wants to hear. And as a result, they'll be telling you everything you want to hear or everything they think you want to hear. So not honesty per se, but everything they think their voters would want to hear and would appeal to their voters.
There's always a difficult political choice when you are speaking to voters, and you see this, but I mean, the United States is a great example of this, where so much of the advertising is what's described as negative. So they try and instill a sense of fear. If you vote for the other person, bad things will happen to you. Our politics isn't quite like that. There are elements of it, absolutely. Some parties maybe more than others. Do you think that big stage, lots of people speaking, quite difficult to punch through the noise a little bit to get to voters? Could we see a little bit of negative campaigning, or do you think mostly people will be positive, by which I mean talking about what their own party is doing?
I think that they would definitely weave a bit of negativity into the speeches. I mean, you can be quite subtle about it. You can just like continue your speech and then have a jab and then continue. And obviously the jab is going to land and people are going to hear it. But if you just continue as though you didn't say it, then they can't say it was purposeful or that you were trying to be negative or to paint your opponent in a bad light. It was just a jab. So I think we will definitely see that. I think there's a lot of sassiness in terms of these speeches if you actually sit and you listen to it. But I do think that I think some would be more direct than others. I would anticipate the EFF to be more direct. I think the ANC tends to be more subtle in terms of how it would take a jab. So it will be interesting to hear what they say.
I mean, I suppose the ANC also has the most to lose. So
Yes.
they're the biggest target, right? So they become the bigger target most of the time.
I think so. One of the things about being the ruling party is, unlike other political parties, you can't talk about what you're going to do because you've done so much already. So people judge you on the basis of what you've done. So I think that's why they would be more subtle or take a more subtle approach. I think if you haven't been in office or you haven't had an entire province, for example, to govern, I think it's easier for you to say, oh, this is what we would do or this is what this one is doing right or wrong. But I think when you are the one in charge, there is more light shown on what you do and what you don't do. And I think that's why newer political parties can be more radical in terms of their manifestos. They can be more radical in terms of their messaging. And I think here you would, for example, the EFF has been in smaller municipalities. They've also been in larger municipalities, but they were coalitions. And you can just blame the failure of the coalition on your coalition partners. But if you are the ANC, you can't really blame it on anyone else because you were the governing party.
There are also the personal relationships that make the, you use the word sassiness, there are other words. And I mean, particularly, obviously, it's the ANC and MK.
Yes.
You know, they've been in court twice already this year over the registration case and the trademark case. And I would imagine, if you're Cyril Ramaphosa, you kind of want to remind people of your view of Jacob Zuma, what happened during state capture and all the rest. And if you're Jacob Zuma, we already know, not particularly fond of Cyril Ramaphosa.
I think that Cyril has been more, I think he's more reserved. And I think even if he had such remarks, I don't think that he's someone who would publicly voice his dismay of someone. I think he doesn't really
Wish
do
he
that.
would.
I don't think he would do that. But I think the former president tends to be more vocal about it. But we've also known him to be quite charismatic. We've known him to appeal to people. And we've known him to say things that other people wouldn't necessarily say. But it's very interesting to follow the developments between the two. I definitely think there is a lot that we don't see. And I kind of wish that we could.
I mean, we've got three parties events today. All of them come from the ANC in some way. And I mean, you know, you can go back, I think, to the 1960s. I think there were columns, and I think the newspaper at the time was called The African Communist. I think it's changed its name since then. I don't know if it still publishes in a physical form. Where people in the ANC made this prediction, you know, that all of our politics in the end, after liberation, I mean, it's very, very far-sighted to think about it, then would come from the ANC. And that's kind of what's happened. I mean, it's really only the Inkatha Freedom Party, and then obviously the DA is a completely different tradition, and also could have been foreseen then. But it's interesting that, you know, it's MK, the EFF and the ANC, and they're all at some point, you know, the arguments were around Jacob Zuma and Julius Malema. I remember when Ramaphosa, you know, signed the expulsion of Julius Malema, which we sometimes forget. I mean, it's interesting that in a way what we're seeing is kind of a family fallout on three separate stages in three separate provinces.
I love the saying, history gives answers to those who care to listen. So I think that's why we can often use like what happens with other liberation movements to mark what we might anticipate would happen. And I think that's exactly what happened in the South African context. What's so interesting about all of this is all of the people who had this fallout with the ANC were very big personalities. I think for other people, they would take more of a back step. I think that with Julius Malema, even during his time in the ANC as the Youth League president, he was very charismatic. He had his own following, he had his own views, and we know with political parties you often have to step in terms of the party line, and we don't always see him doing that. So with him leaving the ANC and then establishing the EFF, that's not much of a surprise in terms of the direction that he's taken with his political party. That's also not a surprise. In terms of the former president, Jacob Zuma's never been one to back down from a fight. I mean, the man has so many political lives. And I think for sure there was in the early 2000s, there was a time when they thought that he wouldn't be making a return to politics, given all of the scandals with regards to the arms deal and everything else that was looming over his head. Still managed to come back during the time when he was sworn in as president. Just before then, there were many corruption charges. I think it was over 400 corruption charges against him at the time. There were so many scandals that he was implicated in, and still he managed to become the president, and he was a president for 9 years. And with him leaving the ANC, especially being forced out, if you want to use that terminology, we knew that he would at some or other point come back and make a comeback. And I think that it was quite exciting that it was on December 16th. I think what made it particularly... A historically
important day in KZN, let's not forget, for various reasons.
Exciting that he chose the name MK because I mean, he used to be like quite at the front and center of the MK. The everything that he chose was it was on brand for him. He had obviously planned this, and he had quite a bit of time to plan. So while some people thought that the man was bored, I think that he definitely was spending his time planning his return. And he said he had unfinished business, and here we see it now.
I mean, he wasn't the founder of the Robben Island Chess Club for nothing, was he? It's interesting, and one of the things that this illustrates in our politics is I would make this suggestion, you tell me if you agree or not, that if you go into an urban area, maybe where people speak, where you hear a lot of English and Afrikaans, people there, say in Joburg, Cape Town, probably cannot understand at all why someone would vote for Jacob Zuma.
Yes.
And if you go into Nkandla, if you go into Umlazi, where you hear more Zulu, hardly any, maybe no English and Afrikaans at all. People there would probably think the DA is literally quite evil and probably cannot understand how you could vote for anyone else, or even Cyril Ramaphosa. To them, it's not really of almost South Africa. I mean, there's a whole thing going on here. And the reason I bring this up is that it worries me sometimes that our country can seem so apart from itself that we can't understand each other. And if you can't understand each other, then you don't know why things happen.
Yeah, I think so. I think to a certain extent, identity plays a key role in terms of what people tend to do. And identity politics is quite big, whether people choose to recognize it or not. If you, for example, as you rightfully mentioned, if you were, for example, in the Free State and you were in Langenhoven Park, predominantly Afrikaans, predominantly DA. There's always been a DA councillor. I don't remember a time where there was actually an ANC person. I think if you went to certain portions of Pretoria where you'd have also predominantly DA people, I think those people wouldn't understand, because I think their emphasis and their values could be slightly different. I think if you were to go to KZN, as you rightfully mentioned, I think they would have different values as well. But I also think like other things such as cultures and norms and traditions play a key role. In some metro areas, you have a more greater emphasis in terms of the individual. What is good for me? Like, what do I want? Like, I would like to not see, yes, I would like to not see my trash when I get out of my house. I would like to very much not drive my fancy car into a pothole and so on. Whereas in other areas like KZN, traditions and norms play a key role, and there it's where your traditional leaders would be more significant. And I think if you are a political party, you need to be aware of the context that you find yourself in, and then you need to find a way to appeal to those people. And I think in the past, the ANC managed to do that. They would go, for example, to the traditional leaders in the for example, in Northwest, where you would go to your Botswana leaders and you would engage with them. You would go to KZN and you would engage with those people and so on. And I think as time went, there was less of a focus on those other elements, and I think more of a focus on the individual. And I think that's why you would also see those splits, and that's why you would also see other political parties coming in and actually benefiting from that.
I mean, in a way, within all of this is a greater conversation around the identity of the South African voter. Now, we don't have the 17 days it would take to have this conversation, but I would suggest that maybe a third, maybe half of South Africans have quite a mixture of urban and rural identities, because almost everyone is from somewhere. And, you know, they're in the city, but they're from somewhere. And where is someone from? Well, where they're from is where they are from the 16th of December to the first week of January, you know, over that Christmas period, which still, you know, goes back to the migrant labour system. There's still so much sort of the role of history in our society. And so, I mean, if you're a political party and you're trying to, you know, say, I'm going for the urban voter, well, good luck, because many of the urban people are, in fact, say they are from somewhere else. But if you're going for the rural voter, well, good luck, because most people spend probably 49 weeks of the year in an urban area.
Yeah. That's quite true. I don't think that there is a single or one-size-fits-all approach, and I think that you have to take these nuances into consideration when you are campaigning, and I think that's why the people who work on your campaign strategy should actually incorporate people who understand cultural differences, people who understand religious beliefs and how you appeal to those people, but also balancing that with values of people in urban areas. For example, what was quite interesting was earlier this year when the ANC went to go visit churches, but they're also trying to appeal to the LGBT community. So how do you balance those interests, and how do you find a way to have common ground? And it matters how you then tailor your messaging to appeal to those different peoples. And as you rightfully mentioned, as a fair-skinned Zulu person, and nobody would believe it, that I spent last December in KZN. Like, it's something that is quite strange if you think that people spend a large portion of their time in urban areas. So I think you have to appeal to the person, the essence of who the person is. And I think people are beyond their racial groupings, beyond the areas in which they live, and so on. So you need to find out what matters to people. And at the end of the day, I think that's where values such as your human rights, trying to appeal to everybody's rights, making sure that everybody's basic needs and everything else is taken into account for. I think that's what also appeals to people, and I think that was one of the things that made the ANC so successful in 1994.